Croeso and welcome to Wales One World Film Festival, our 21st edition. We are delighted to bring you our panellists from across the globe, and we're partnering with the Global Environments Network, an international network dedicated to social and ecological justice and planetary well-being. We hope you watched the films in our Ecosinema strand, but fear not if you haven't. You're still very welcome to take part, and hopefully this is going to be a really fascinating, wide-roving, expansive, exploratory discussion. So yeah, these three films that we're looking at aren't simply tales of ecological woe. They're a bit more buoyant, they're a bit more hopeful than that, and that's why we chose them. They might seem like strange kind of titles to sit next to each other, but we thought actually these are examples of films that are demonstrating resilience and creative responses to this so-called Anthropocene. So the films that we'll be discussing, or rather using as jump-off points for a discussion, are Reflection, A Walk with Water, which explores the many ways and people of repairing damaged landscapes, specifically water. The Mushroom Speaks, a fascinating cast of mycologists and citizen scientists and professional scientists hold our ear up to the world of the fungus. And Aya, which is a beautifully shot film and details the disintegration of an island sandscape in tandem with the disappearing physical space of childhood. It's a fiction film, but it's got a very documentary feel, and it's very poetic in that way. So these stories, these people and these characters through these films, they demonstrate, I think, for me personally, the power of resilience and that hope of doing something in the face of this great threat, climate chaos. So what emerges from these three films is a sense of, I guess, intergenerational and interspecies dialogue, which invites reflection on how these unfolding stories both question and offer solutions to the status quo. So just a bit of housekeeping. We're really keen to hear from you guys. This is going to be about an hour, and we please ask if you can put your questions in the chat box, and we'll hope to receive them all, and we'll hope to get to them. So yeah, please, it's interactive in that sense. So I'd very much like to welcome and give a very brief introduction to our panelists. Minni Jain is Operations Director of the Flow Partnership, working globally on community-driven, decentralized catchment and landscape restoration water projects. She does many other things, and she is based in the UK, originally from India, but she works globally. Kendi Borona is a conservation professional with 13 years of experience in diverse landscapes across Africa. A firm believer in the application of Indigenous knowledge in conservation and community livelihoods, Kendi's book, Reclaiming Indigenous Knowledge Systems, explores how Indigenous knowledge and community-led education can revitalise our human connection to the land. And then Fergus Drennan is a wild food experimentalist and educator who runs total immersion foraging courses. They're great, by the way. I've been on one some years ago. He has written on wild food and foraging for BBC Country Farm magazine, The Ecologist, Country Kitchen, Bushcraft and Survival Skills magazine, as well as many other publications. And I also know he's a very deep thinker because I've met the man several times. So I'd like to dive in a bit deeper to introduce our panelists and what they're about and what they do. So Minni, if I can invite you to speak and tell us a little bit more about the Flow Partnership, what you do and how that relates to water.
Thank you, Phil. So as Phil mentioned, I run an NGO called the Flow Partnership, and we set up the Flow Partnership a few years ago, about 10 or 12 years ago, when we saw this fantastic work of a man called Rajinder Singh in India, where he had worked with local communities using their own traditional wisdom and knowledge to revive completely dead, dry, degenerated landscapes and bring 7 rivers back to life. So when I first heard 7 rivers back to life, that immediately in my mind was, how did he do that? How did the communities do that? And when we dug deeper, we found that there is a vast repository of community wisdom around the landscape, around water, which is there across the world. and that rarely makes it to the news. That's it works, it's successful, and yet communities, they need to share this knowledge, they need to amplify this work, they need to do more and more of it on the ground. So we set up the Flow Partnership to do precisely that, to work with communities. So we say it's community driven, decentralized, so it's not driven by us, it's driven by them. Water management, bringing the water back where it is desertified, where there are arid landscapes, and where there are flooded landscapes, taking the water away in a manner that it goes to a place where it's needed and stops flooding the areas that are there. And I'll stop here, and I'm sure we'll discover more as we go on.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Minni. That's fascinating and a lot to think about in that very short moment already. Kendi, please, and welcome from Kenya. Please, if you can just introduce yourself a bit more and tell us about your fascinating work and a bit about your book, if you don't mind.
So thanks, Phil, and thanks, everyone. And I'm happy to be on this panel. I was saying that I'm a conservationist with a focus on the African context. I've worked in many African countries, primarily on community-based conservation. And my doctoral work focused on Indigenous Knowledge Systems and forest governance. And that is the material that I used to publish the book, which is Reclaiming Indigenous Knowledge Systems. I am largely interested in conservation that is tied to the imperatives of social justice. Over the course of history, conservation hasn't been very friendly to African peoples and other peoples across the global south and other parts of the world, actually. So I'm in the space of land rights, community-based conservation, rights to environmental resources, and revitalization of indigenous knowledge systems, essentially reinserting people back into the landscapes that they have been dismantled from. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Kendi. And there's a lot there and many questions I have to ask you. So thank you very much for that fuller introduction. Fergus, please, welcome to the panel. And if you can let us know a little bit more about your work and specifically your work and fascination with fungi.
So I've been working quite intensely with wild food plants since 1990. And it's my particular way to really explore all sorts of ideas, like what does it mean to be human in the modern world? What does it mean to be connected with nature? What does it mean to connect with nature through wild food, and to what extent can that be relevant in the modern world, particularly in a so-called developed country like we are? So, and that might all sound very serious, but it's incredibly fun and playful and engaging of all the senses. And I think I'm just lucky also in that something which was a hobby that I was intuitively and naturally drawn to is something that there is a real hunger for, because people are hungry to connect with the natural world, connect with each other, connect with themselves. And I think through wild plants in particular and through food, there's a real opportunity to do that. So my exploration is predominantly through wild food, but at the moment I'm not making this up, but I can't sit at my table because it's completely covered in King Alfred's cakes, which is a mushroom which was used by our ancestors to carry an ember from like fire to another campsite, and that they're all sporulating all over there. I look over there, I've got amadou mushrooms that I've been learning how to make hats from, which I've got one here, not that I made, but it's traditionally made in Romania, and it's been a real journey to unlock like how you do that. So I've been discovering it myself. So it's also learning about these not always ancient, I mean, in terms of like King Alfred's cakes being used for thousands of years, but the Romanian tradition, I think, stretches back 150, 200 years. But it's those traditions of working with plants and fungi in particular, which I find very, very exciting. And they're another way of drawing people in to think about their connection with the natural world. So that's a kind of snapshot of things I'm up to and I'm interested in.
Wow. Fantastic, Fergus. Thank you very much for that. And that's wonderful to think that you're in those mushrooms, those fruiting bodies are in that room with you. That's brilliant. And I think the theme I'm getting, and I don't want to do anyone a disservice who's come to this conversation to talk about the Anthropocene, but I do want to keep it light. And I think, Fergus, to borrow your words, fun and playful, I think that's a really wonderful thing, that you're exploring the natural world in that way. So just to talk about the films a little bit more, and just if any latecomers have arrived, our films as so much as the topics within the films. They are experts and practitioners in their fields around the environment and ecology. So Minni, the film Reflection, tell us a little bit about that, because I understand that you actually know the director, and and how did you meet him, and where did you meet him?
Thanks, Phil. Actually, I don't know Emmett, who is the director of the film, but I know various people who were on the walk that he did with, which is the thread that goes throughout the whole film. I found it a fascinating and absolutely beautifully shot film, and very sensitive and very, very truthful and real to the search that Emmett was on. And he says that it's a coming of age. He was searching, it was a coming of age time for him, and how powerful that he took us through that journey and realized that, he came of age when he realized that everything revolved around water. That is truly coming of age, when you realize your responsibility and shared stewardship of the place you call home. That's when you grow up. And he traces it beautifully in the film through the conversations with various people on the ground, philosophers, thinkers, walkers, and with the thread of the walk that this group did, Walking Water did across the aqueduct, the LA aqueduct in the Owens Valley. So, and it's beautifully shot. So I think I probably have gone beyond the question you've asked me, but the film was a very true reflection of how water pervades every question we have in life. And when you come of age, and you come of age when you understand that responsibility to the environment and to nature and to the gifts nature has given us.
No, that's beautiful. Thank you very much for saying that. And it often makes me think, we call our planet Earth, but maybe we should call it planet water, because the majority of it is water, and it's so important to everything. So yeah, and I think what was so beautiful about the film is that it was restorative, and it was solution sort of oriented. And I didn't really understand the extent to which that part of the US was desertified by the misuse and abuse of water. So yeah, I really recommend people watch that. We'll come back to that a bit later. In the other film, Aya, hopefully some people saw that. The sea, or in the case, the water, has a kind of a dual relationship with the community. The film is set in the Ivory Coast, and it has a kind of dual relationship with the community in the sense that it's a life giver, but it's also a life taker. And I mean, this is maybe shoehorning the question a bit, but Kendi, with your work on conservation projects and working directly with people, why is it important to have people who are on the ground? Why is it important to have their voice in conservation projects, especially if they're internationally minded?
I think that having people on the ground, or people who understand the local context of conservation, is absolutely critical. And this is one of the major issues in the conservation field, at least in the African context. I can speak to that authoritatively because I've worked in that sector for a long time. There's the overall notion in the conservation sector is that African people do not know conservation. They need to be taught conservation, preferably by a white person or some other African elite who have been educated and have got degrees and all of this. But conservation is about the land, is about interaction with the land and the landscape, everything in the landscape, including water, including food, including pastoral systems for pastoral communities, fishing knowledge systems for fishing communities, hunting and gathering systems of those communities. And it is through those land use practices that you develop a conservation ethic. You cannot be a good farmer without being a good conservationist. Neither can you be a good pastoralist, and neither can you be a good hunting and gathering, at least in a sustainable way. In all of these communities, you find an ethos of sustainability because you have to manage your resources in a good way, such that you can have them tomorrow and the day after and for generations to come. So the notion that people do not know conservation originates from the colonial period, where you have the European countries coming to civilize the natives, and the natives don't know anything. So we have to take charge of the land and show them how to use the land, which in many cases has led to numerous ecological catastrophes when you ignore the knowledge systems about the land and you supplant that with another knowledge system, which is probably, and in most cases, not suitable to those kinds of landscapes. So there's a growing shift or change in the conservation landscape to sort of embrace or work with communities living around conservation areas. But we're not there yet. The narrative is very strong, but we remain hopeful that there will be change and transformation going forward, at least within the context that we have of climate change and huge biodiversity losses across the globe.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Thank you, Kendi. And I think that's a really important and very truthful and factual analysis of the idea of, the colonial element of conservation. And I think you put it really beautifully, this conservation ethic. And I think that cuts across the work that you do, Kendi, and Minni and Fergus. This idea of the ethic of conservation threads through your work and citizen science. And I think Fergus, in the film The Mushroom Speaks, we've got this whole cast of citizen scientists and professional scientists as well, and their enthusiasm for the humble fungus, the humble mushroom, which is really kind of fascinating. So Minni, back to you. Tell us a little bit more about the inspiration behind your work and the Seven Rivers project that you mentioned earlier.
One of the main inspiration came from when you meet the communities and they know what to do. Whenever you find communities that are running out of water or they are flooded, and they know what to do, and yet they are unable to do it. So that was such a huge question for us, that if you know what to do, why aren't you doing it? And of course, the challenge that comes is often that the resource challenge is one of the biggest things. But the other thing is that when there's this cycle of degradation that begins to happen, and you become poorer and poorer, and you're fighting against something which is relentless, there is also a sense of apathy. And also in villages, then you have the youth leave, they migrate. So that any energy that can actually be put into regeneration work has gone. So for us, what was really inspiring was if the communities know what to do. We don't have to tell them. In fact, when we do the work with communities, we say the most successful day is when the communities tell us, go away, now we don't need you anymore. You've done your bit. And we always do the work with communities in participation. You do it together with them. And it's they have something, we have something, you bring it together, and then the magic happens. And can we amplify their work? This is not rocket science. It's not expensive. Building an intervention in the landscape to hold the water, allowing it to percolate, to recharge the aquifer or evaporate so that it creates clouds and rain, and regenerates the small water cycle or the large, is not rocket science. It's actually just that, literally that. Of course, behind that is a whole series of actions, but that is in the hands of the myriad communities that live on the ground in the planet. It's not us alone. We are doing this together. So that was our inspiration. When we saw the work that can happen, the steps that we can take, they're not complicated. We just have to hold the water and then see the magic that happens. That was the inspiration behind the work we do.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. That's another brilliant, impassioned answer. And I think that's a beautiful word, participation, as well. And I think, again, with your work, with Kendi's work, and Fergus, you mentioned this mushroom. Sorry, I've forgotten the name of it, but on your table, how it was used to pass on fire. This idea of participation and working with others. You said with your work, wild foraging and going out and reigniting people's interest in nature and the natural world. I mean, how important is that to you for people to kind of really participate in and feel like they actually have a sense of the world, not just from a screen by watching a film or academically, but actually getting their hands in the soil or getting their hands dirty, as it were? How important is that to you?
In a kind of era when, you know, the production values of some of the films are out there, and think of like Blue Planet and things like this. And I think sometimes we can be mistaken for thinking that we understand about the natural world because we have such high quality images and kind of stories around it. But, you know, you could take 1,000 blue planets, and I don't think that can substitute for one, you know, really meaningful, direct connection with a plant, really, because, you know, you're in the orbit of that plant or that fungi. You're breathing it in, you're relating to it. Your senses are involved in a different way than you are, you know, in front of a screen. So I think and people know that, they intuitively know that they're being somehow sold short by these, you know, programs that, you know, say they are there to educate and entertain, but in a sense they are, they don't offer the true connection that actually being out, obviously, in the natural world brings. So yeah,
of course. No, that's really fascinating. I love how you put it, you know, being in the orbit of another physical entity, whether that's a flower or a mushroom body. And that reminds me, and this is a question to all three of you, I suppose, because there is another connection with you three, the citizen science aspect, the element of participation and working with rather than over people. But you've all had your role in some videos, and Minni, you've commissioned something for the Flow Partnership. And Kendi, you've also an executive producer on a small video. Do you want to tell us a bit about that? Because what I'm interested in, from a WOW perspective and hopefully the audience perspective, is the power of story. So whether that's through the medium of film or if we're sat round a fire, and the importance of story in carrying the fire, carrying ideas and carrying education. So Kendi, tell us a bit about the process of the film you made and the inspiration behind it.
So the film is, I forget the title of my own film. Has to do with the legacy of Wangari Maathai, the Nobel laureate Professor Wangari Maathai, and it's a canopy of hope, the legacy of Wangari Maathai. I'll put it in the chat once I finish speaking. And the film showcases 4 Kenyan environmentalists or people involved in conservation who have been inspired by the work and the legacy of Professor Wangari Maathai. For people who might not be familiar with her work, she did a lot of grassroots mobilization in restoring degraded ecosystems, stopping the grabbing of public lands, especially forests, and mobilizing communities at the grassroots to take an interest in their resources and to take care of their resources, and also making the link between the environmental issues and governance, and also environmental issues and peace. Those are some of the key planks of the Nobel Peace Prize that she won, I think, in 2011 or before that.
Yes.
So the film looks at the work of 4 Kenyan environmentalists who have been inspired by the work and the legacy of Wangari Maathai. And in the film, we've got someone working on food and seed sovereignty with communities at the grassroots level. We've got someone working in the ecotourism domain, mobilizing communities around their landscapes. We've got a photojournalist or an environmental photographer in the film, and we've got myself working on Indigenous Knowledge Systems. And the point of the film was to, again, illustrate that Africans are interested in conservation and are actually working or have been working for long years in the conservation sector and contributing to conservation thought and practice and carrying on the legacy and the work of Professor Wangari Maathai. That was what informed or shaped the film.
Ah, fantastic. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed the filmmaking experience. It's probably very different from writing a book and your doctoral research as well. Thank you. Minni, so yeah, I know that you had made or had a film commissioned for the Flow Partnership. So I guess to ask the obvious question, why did you feel that was important for you and your organization to have a story that you could communicate with people?
As you said earlier, what is the importance of stories? Stories are what connect us as human beings. They not only tell us what is the story of our age. So, for example, the film that we made, it's a 6-minute film. It's about a project. I'll tell you a bit more in a minute. But they tell the story of what is currently happening. But stories also leap out from across the ages and give us a direction, a compass of where to go, how to go, where are we going. So we all have universal stories as human beings that connect us. There's a story of the planet. So for us, the best stories are the ones that give you, a sense of where you are and a possibility, a glimpse of where you could go. And so the short film that we've made is called Water for All. And it was done by a lovely young filmmaker in India who was with us for the whole project when we started the conversations with the community, and the community told us what they wanted to do. And then COVID-19 hit, and how many migrants from the villages, cities came back to the villages, the same villages that they had left because there was no food or water, and they went to the city. And then you have COVID-19 and there's a lockdown. They walked hundreds of miles to go back to those same villages, saying they'd rather die in their own homes and their villages than in a heartless city. And then what happened? With this project, with the community building their intervention, they're called Joherds in Rajasthan in India, and then we found similar interventions across the world in different communities. However, this particular film was around that. And they built this intervention, and when the rains came, it filled with water, and then, the farmers were able to grow absolute, the crops that they grew were, double, treble. And because the water was there, the animals had water, there was the dairy industry started, all within the space of 8-9 months. It's like magic. How can you not share that magic? And when you hear of stories of aridity and floods across the world, you want to tell people, look, these guys have done this. They had no resources before. They didn't have food to eat. And look, they've held the water, and what has the water done? So that is that story which takes you across the planet, connects you from one community to another, and gives you a feeling of what is possible when we work together with each other and learn from each other. So that's what we did. It's Water for All. I can put the link in if anybody wants to have a look. But it's a true story of from 2019, January 2019 to September, when the rains came, of how the community brought the water and regenerated their landscape in Rajasthan in India.
Wow, amazing. Yeah, thank you so much. And I really love the way you said, films can, show us a sense of where we are and possibilities, where we can go. And I think that's why for WOW and the Ecosinema strand, we chose these films that were explicitly positive or solution-based, like Reflection, like the mushroom speaks, rather than wallowing in the lament and negativity. So yeah, that's really, really, really interesting to hear and really beautifully put. And yeah, Fergus, you've been involved in some video productions before. How does that feel as an educator and communicator, if I can call you that temporarily? Obviously, you're you explore plants and our relationship to plants, but how is storytelling important to you as an educator and communicator?
It's interesting because I was recording a radio program today. I do a radio program for local radio every 2 weeks, and I was interviewing a friend of mine, a storyteller, today, all about the importance of storytelling, both for adults and just in the modern world, and healing stories, all sorts of stories. But I started with a bit of foraging, and I was talking about wild garlic flower buds. Wild garlic are coming up now, and I like to sort them, and in the way that the Italians treat capers. And my Italian girlfriend, she used to go to this one caper bush that her family's been going to for decades. And so I applied this principle to that. And then I was thinking about capers myself, because I only had 10 minutes, because I was so long with this interview with the storyteller. And I thought, what is it that one of the things I find so profoundly satisfying and enriching about wild food? And so I was thinking about real capers. So I thought, okay, I'm going to tell a 5-minute story. I'm not going to tell a whole story, because the whole story would, to give it justice, would take about 20 minutes. But I had a jar of capers, which I bought from the shop, from the caper bush, and I can see them over there, and a jar of capers that I picked in a Sinai desert a couple of years ago. Now, that jar that I picked in the Sinai desert, there was an amazing adventure that happened then. I was in Dahab, and I was leaving town. This kind of wolf-like dog walked in as the sun was rising. We kind of looked at each other, about 100 meters apart. We're still looking at each other. And in the end, this dog, it turned around, and we went on this adventure for the whole day. And I'd been warned of this notorious desert wadi called dog wadi, where there's these really kind of aggressive dogs. Don't ever go there. Don't ever. And anyway, I went on this long adventure with this dog. I gave the dog my last water because it was thirsty after about 3 hours in this natural indentation in a rock. And I discovered that I was approaching desert wadi, and it was terrible. I was terrified. And I said to this dog, it's now become my friend, I said, I'm really scared. What can you do? This dog departed into the middle of, must have been about 200 dogs. I never saw it again, but some dialogue went on. And although these dogs were barking and aggressive, I felt safe, I felt protected. But the point of this, there was this whole rich story that went into this simple jar of capers that I had, that where I connected with the landscape. I identified caper bush for the first time. And that's just one example. So it's just like, and I think of all the times when I forage, it could be alone, and I might have some amazing kind of thought or idea, because it's very meditative, or it might be an adventure with a friend, or it might be when I'm leading a course. But in the experiences, the fun we're having, there are multiple layers to that final food that's being eaten. It might be something that's gathered fresh. It might be something that's just, it's in a jar, or it's a dried mushroom. But I can be opening a bag of dried mushrooms, and I remember who I was with, what happened, things that were going on in my life, things that were going on in the world, and they're embodied in that, and that's lost from things that we, very thankfully we can get very conveniently, but sometimes it's very inconvenient in those deep stories that really connect us to the landscape, to each other, to ourselves, are lost. So absolutely. I think that's why storytelling is that, yeah, I don't know, I can't remember what your question was, but
no, absolutely, I'm not sure I can. Minni, did I see your hand go up? Did you want to respond to
No,
that?
I was just thumbs up to what Fergus just said
Yeah.
about the layers in a story, the layers in something which in natural food or wild food or the landscape that get lost when we are with factory given conveniences. There are, the stories over there are completely lost. So therefore our connection with nature is lost. When our connection with nature is lost, it's much easier to use it and abuse it and exploit it for our own benefit. So Fergus is so right that we have to bring back that connection, and that can only happen when we do the hard work. We make the choice to be more mindful of what we eat or what we use or what we the stories that come with that connection to, in whatever we surround ourselves within our lives. And that is where the power of the story begins to evoke a sense of playfulness, as Fergus said, a sense of responsibility, a sense of looking after our home with joy. Not like, oh man, we finished the planet, better do something. No, you love your home, then you do something. So thank you, Fergus. That was so beautifully said.
Thank you, Minni. I think, Fergus, you wanted to respond to that?
Kind of responding to that, but also as what Kendi was saying at the beginning about the, the hunter-gatherers or the indigenous communities that are harvesting wild food. It's like, in terms of profound stories connected with wild food, the first story that you learn is that you don't overexploit the abundance that's there. And I'm careful there because I don't want to say exploit the resources of there, because I think it can sometimes be dangerous to think of things purely in terms of resources, because often the implication there is resources for human use. They're there for the whole other web of life that depends on these things. But that, that is the fundamental story. And of course, this carries on from what I was saying before about, I've gathered something and there's the whole story there, which is very rich. But when we're sourcing our food, and I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing to get food from supermarkets, and I'm very grateful, and I shop at supermarkets, but in that supermarket world of omnipresent availability, where we can overexploit, we can overeat, we can keep going, and the shelves will be replenished, and that lesson is completely lost. And there's an environmental impact of everything, but when everything is just it's a universal summer of abundance, and so we don't see the direct consequence of what would happen if we had a more authentic, local, engaged connection with our food sources.
Yeah, fantastic. I love that, a universal summer of abundance. I might have to steal that, Fergus. That's brilliant. And I think you've done a really interesting, I'm loving the direction this conversation is going, by the way. I hope our guests and panelists are. I'll come to you in a moment, Kendi. But I think, Fergus, you've alluded to that fact of shifting that very anthropocentric perspective. And I think that's a really interesting use of the word, or being careful of the word resource, because a resource, it becomes a kind of monetized thing that's put into spreadsheets. Actually, we're into relationship with it. And Kendi, I would like to bring you back in to talk about that relationship. And I can see that you're smiling, and I can see maybe that you've got some thoughts to respond to what Fergus and Minni have said. So please, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add about the storytelling aspect. And when I was listening to Fergus and Minni, what came to my mind were stories that were and are told in African settings. And many of these stories include both wildlife and humans in a shared landscape. And they speak to the interactions between humans and wildlife. Not necessarily always happy relationships, but they speak to a shared landscape. Unlike the situation that we have created where we remove people from the landscape and keep animals there and say that if you trespass, you'll be shot. but then also bring another group of people known as tourists who are only allowed to see this wildlife that all of us are so interested in, elephants and lions and the like. So that aspect of storytelling, I think, and these were told mainly to young children at night by the fireside. You grow up with the understanding that you're not the only being in this landscape. That there are other animals and wildlife and other players in the landscape, and that you must interact with them. You must share the landscape with them, and so on and so forth. And that's the power, I think, of storytelling in terms of grounding people in the landscape and also making them more humble in their landscape as contrasted to what we've become as this overbearing creature within the landscape or within the environment, which has led, of course, to all of these things, climate change and huge losses of biodiversity.
Oh yeah, beautifully said, Kendi. And I think that's a really interesting point, grounding people in the landscape. And I think that's a really important word. I remember an ecologist saying to me one time, maybe it was more polemical, but he said, I don't really like using environment because it's a bit indistinct, it's a bit indifferent. So I use the word biosphere when it comes to the relationship with human and non-human worlds. And I think that also there's a relationship between, you know, grounding humans and humus, you know, the soil from which we all arise from. And you really see that in The Mushroom Speaks. I forget her name, Fergus might be able to remind us, but the lady who wrote The Mushroom at the End of the World, she speaks about the mushroom as this pioneer species, and that's a really strong part of landscaping. Yes, so yeah, this is going in a really interesting direction. I have a question, sort of comment from Helen Joy to everyone, how she's a local producer, which is fantastic, all for that. And she said she's noticed a real increase in direct sales from producers to consumers, and this idea of I guess a transaction between the consumer and the producer, especially when it comes to local and direct. It's not just the transaction of the food, but as Helen is saying, you know, there's an engagement with the customers, there's combating loneliness, as well as keeping people fed with rich food. And I think that's a really important element of our relationship with the land, and understanding the people who are growing the food in the land. So yeah, so Minni, the film Reflection, there were many permaculturalists and all those kind of kooky creative types. Have you come across much permaculture work in when it comes to what would we call it, waterscaping or water management?
All the time. I mean, permaculture, the organic farming, biodynamic farming, agroforestry, these are all different systems which pretty much in our roots to becoming a healthy landscape, regenerative agriculture. So it's how you manage your landscape, and as Kendi said, in a collaboration with all the other beings that live in it. It's an interconnection. You don't do it just as you know, using your mind and this is what you do, and you know, you have it cut and dried, and this is how you will connect. No, it is an interconnection, some of which are visible to us and some of which are not. It's like the mycelium in that film. That is what that interconnected weave that connects us, and permaculture is very much like that. And what we say is that, you know, you have carbon, you have soil, you have all these building blocks that are life, that are the building blocks of life. Yet, and it's like the engines, as I saw in a particular film in Kiss the Ground, that carbon is the engine that drives the planet. But if carbon's the engine, then the fuel for that engine is water. Without water, we wouldn't be here. Without water, you wouldn't have that humus, that organic, rich matter that, you know, that is healthy, that gives you the healthy crops, that keeps the animals healthy, that keeps those interconnections alive. So permaculturists and others of those ilk and the creative cookie types, as you say, that's what they understand and that's what they do. And just to add to what Helen was saying about there are now a lot of local producers, local producers are rebuilding that mycelium, that interconnectedness of the local community in terms of growing food and in the local surroundings and sharing it with your local people. So, and the stories that come alive through that. You're more likely, if you know the farmer who's growing it, you're delighted to buy that. You're delighted to know, the family, you know what they do. So it's those interconnections which permaculturists bring to life.
Fantastic, fascinating stuff. And that makes me wonder as well, the relationship between I guess traditional knowledge systems and citizen science. And I think this is an open question to all three of you, and I'm trying to formulate it as I speak aloud. But I just wonder how fragile that link between a knowledge of place, and that might mean a knowledge of the plants, the animals, the actual specific landscape, how kind of fragile that is for humans if it's not passed on, or if somehow it's lost or broken, and how important that knowledge is in carrying on the stewardship of a landscape in a way that is more, dare I say it, harmonious, but certainly more balanced rather than resource extractive directed. So that's a kind of open question about the fragility of, I guess, knowledge, because I think in the film Reflection and certainly Mushroom Speaks, both documentaries, I got a really strong sense that there was this this energy from younger people that were almost relearning, remembering ideas and concepts that weren't necessarily novel or new, but they were bringing a freshness to it. And so I'm just really interested in that relationship between, let's say, indigenous knowledge or embodied knowledge and maybe its fragility.
Yeah, I can probably go first on this and say that indigenous knowledge or knowledge systems are lost when people do not use the land, where using the land can be a whole sort of different things. In the film Reflections, people are using the land by actually walking on the land and understanding the water system. And I found it extremely fascinating just to understand that whole ecology. You can't understand that in a classroom or in any other setting other than actually doing that walk. And if I look at it from my context, knowledge is lost when communities' livelihoods are criminalized. For instance, let's talk about pastoralism. Most of the wildlife that you find in African contexts, these charismatic megafauna, elephants, lions, all of these, the big five and whatnot, are found in areas where you have pastoral communities. And the reason why you have wildlife in those places is because the pastoral economy or the pastoral mode of action is aligned with wildlife. That wildlife and livestock can share landscapes. If you turn those places into agricultural landscapes, you will not have wildlife. It will be gone in a very short period of time. So knowledge is created by using the land. And when you stop, let's say, farming, you stop small-scale agriculture and you say you want to do plantation, large-scale farming, then you lose a whole knowledge system of seed, keeping seed, propagation of crops, or preservation of crops after harvesting, and so on and so forth. So knowledge is produced by using or by being on the land. So we have to support those modes of production, whether it's small-scale farming or pastoralism or hunting and gathering, etc., to sustain knowledge systems and to have them transmitted to younger generations.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, thank you for that elucidation and clarification, Kendi. And I think that's a really interesting example in a European context, but I can only really speak for Great Britain, Wales and England, in the sense that agriculture in this part of the world is very much big scale, and it's a real problem that knowledge isn't passed because family farms are, you know, fragmented, and that they're no longer kind of family-based enterprises, and that's happened within, you know, 1 or 2 generations. So it's really interesting to hear you say that. Another thought that's been sparked like a mushroom cloud from the conversation so far is this idea of walking, as you said, Kendi, you know, walking into the landscape, with the landscape. That's how we really learn. And we see in the film Reflection, there's that pilgrimage with walking, pilgrimage with water. And Fergus, a lot of your work involves walking, and I think there must be something to the pace of walking that lends itself kind of philosophically, but maybe, dare I say, energetically, to this idea of being in orbit with other plants and other non-human beings. What do you make to that?
Wasn't it Jean-Jacques Rousseau that wrote a book, something like The Reflections of a Long Distance Walker or something? But anyway, he just talked about how it's great for reflection, and it's true. But it's interesting because when you were asking this question, I was thinking, well, what is indigenous knowledge in my context? You know, it's like, I mean, so much of it's lost. And then I was kind of thinking, well, the knowledge and how it's sourced, it's more of a state of mind, you know, a state of being, a state of awareness. And I think, and to me, it sometimes comes as a gift, and I can only really describe it. I can't really describe it because it's indescribable, but perhaps as a state of flow where being outside, and I find it particularly happens as you cross that threshold from perhaps a more arable or open landscape into the depth of the woodland, and you enter a kind of magical realm where there seems to be a flow of direct communication and dialogue between yourself and the plants, and it's non-verbal, and you can pick up a lot of information in this way. And I find that the only way that this can happen is through years of being out there on the land, making those connections. And that is how I think Indigenous knowledge is formulated and understood. And I was also kind of reflecting about that it takes time. And although it can come as a gift, there's a certain receptiveness to allow that to happen, and that involves being quite grounded and aware of your surroundings. And then I think about the modern world and why maybe that knowledge can be hard to come by. And I was starting to think of busyitis. That's what I was thinking of. It's like, you know, we're so busy, we're so caffeinated, we're so rushing on to the next project and a million things to do. Yes. And then what came to my mind, and because sometimes people say, well, you know, foraging, well, doesn't that take a lot of time? It's very, very time consuming. I say, time consuming? Well, okay, if we have to use those terms, yeah, but in a really wonderful way. Yeah. But you know, these are just spontaneous things that came up to me when you were speaking, and I was thinking of a woman in the States called Kendi Borona. I think she writes about a lot about ancestral movement. Okay. And she talks about this concept of life stacking, which I really love, because it's like, okay, people can't acquire that indigenous way of thinking and being because they're too busy. It's like, okay, I can't go and forage because I've got to look after the kids, and you know, I've got to do exercise today, I've got to go to yoga class, you know, I've got to go shopping and get my food. And she says, well, forget about that, thinking it in this linear way, like stack it. Like, okay, you go out into the woods with your kids, right? Okay, that's time spent with your kids. You're gathering a few mushrooms. It's nature connection. You're getting your food. It's very meditative. So you're feeling grounded. You're less stressed. So in these ways, I think we can slowly enter into a way of being where an indigenous way of thinking, and thereby an indigenous way of accumulating knowledge, can be harnessed, but it's difficult.
Beautiful. Yeah. I that's again, Fergus, that's so eloquently put, and it makes me sad that Fergus, Minni, Kendi, I'm not actually, we're not together walking, maybe with everyone who's participating. Imagine that. Imagine we were doing this whilst walking, and maybe just stopping to go, oh, look, you know, there's a really interesting mushroom there, or look at that, there's an interesting animal track there or something. So I think, you know, maybe we can do that in a kind of post-Zoom world, but there is some merit for immediate connections. But yeah, Fergus, I hear what you're saying, and I think that resonates with myself, and dare I say it, with a lot of the people who are participating now. And yeah, I think that's really fascinating, the pace of things and this idea of time. And I guess, Minni, you know, water as a concept, not as a concept, as a thing, isn't it so bizarre? And water, you know, just has no sense of time. It is a constant recycler, and it moves through things quickly or slowly. I mean, how much of like water's kind of chemical embodiment informs your ideas about maybe how you go about project managing and
Sorry, I missed the last bit, Phil, but I could respond to it very quickly in that the nature of water is to flow, and when we flow with our landscapes and our lives and flow in a measured way, then we are truly in harmony with indigenous knowledge, with modern knowledge. And that's what I find the youth of today are plugging into. When you see in that film, a lot of young people, it resonated with them, this idea of walking in the landscape and understanding through their whole being what our ancestors knew and understood. And somewhere in the middle, we had lost that, but it's coming back through the young people today. And that's the hope. You know, our generation, we've done our bit. We've done some things right. We've done some things terribly wrong. But it's the youth of today that's taking up that challenge of understanding that landscape and walking with it and flowing with the water to see where we could actually take the planet further. And that's really beautifully reflected in the film Reflection, that what you can understand in that walking, what you were saying, Phil, just now, about walking together and understanding and seeing a bit of this and seeing a bit of, and that understanding that comes, which is non-verbal, and yet which is verbal with your companions, that understanding is what helps you make some meaning out of your life. So I would really, I would urge you all who haven't yet seen the film Reflection to definitely see it and see what Emmett has given us through that a vignette in his life of flowing with the water.
Oh, yeah, fantastic. Thank you. I'm very conscious of time, sadly. My time management personally isn't great, but maybe that's because I like to, you know, go for a meander on the land and get distracted. But I'm conscious we've just gone past 7:30. So I'd like to invite the panel for any kind of closing comments or thoughts or reflections about the conversation we've had so far, and or any of the ideas sparked from the films. Kendi, if we can begin with you, please.
Thanks, Phil. Just a quick word about the film. I thought it was very well shot, incredibly moving, especially in demonstrating the emotional toll of climate change to people who have really contributed very little to the climate change crisis that we're having, but also to show the resilience of how communities are dealing, or people are dealing with it, and how they are, the love that they have for their land and the landscape, and the efforts that they will go to also keep the memories of their loved ones alive, including exhuming their bodies and putting them in a safer place. So I thought that was very good, a very good illustration of that. And I think it's a good tool moving forward in terms of showing the toll that it has on humanity, or the humanity that is affected by climate change issues in very many different dimensions. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Kendi, and thank you for those lovely words about the film. This is a film festival after all, and you've reminded me, I think, yeah, there was something very sort of poetic as well about, there's that scene in the film where one of the elders says it used to take 2 hours to walk to the graveyard, and now it's just a matter of minutes. And there's something in that, I guess, sadness of interring, or rather disinterring the bodies from the graves, you know, taking them away to preserve their memory because, you know, of today's actions of the changing climate. There's a kind of quiet poetry. So yeah, thank you for those words about Aya. Minni, any closing thoughts, comments, or reflections?
Yes. So Jacques Cousteau said that we forget that the life cycle and the water cycle are one. And I say we must never forget that the life cycle and the water cycle are one. And in the film Reflection, towards the end, Emmett says that, you know, that if we can be wise, sensitive, and healing of of our planet in the condition it is now, then we have really learned you know, the way to go forward. So, you know, I urge everyone to think of their water footprint, to think of, be mindful of each one's own footprint on the planet, and go forward with what you can do with that.
Fantastic, thank you, Minni. And Fergus, any reflections?
Yeah, I would say, you know, watch this film, or the book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, which I can see on my shelf up there, only half read. But it's interesting. I was thinking, I think I do a good job of kind of inspiring people to connect with the natural world when they come on my courses. But do you know what? When I think of fungi courses, so many people over the last year have come and they knew nothing about fungi. And the reason they are there is because they've read Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake. And I think he single-handedly has done so much to inspire a new generation of people to think about the whole realm of fungi and our relation with them. So if you haven't read that book and you want to be inspired about fungi, I would highly recommend that.
Oh, thank you so much, Fergus, and thank you for those recommendations, and especially the idea of life stacking. I think that's really inspired some of our participants. So yeah, I just want to say a final thank you to all our participants, Kendi Borona, who's hailing from Kenya right now, and Minni Jain, who's in Staverton, just outside Totnes, and then Fergus Drennan, who's in East Sussex, I believe. I can't quite remember where. But thank you all three so much for your time, and thank you all for your questions and thoughts and comments in the chat box. And I really hope you get to see these films and chase up some of these ideas and links that we shared, and continue forth and enjoy. Thank you very much.